If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you are going to start your own podcast, or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you're going to need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. And if you ever want to read a book I have mentioned on this podcast, I now have an affiliated link for Bookshop. All the affiliated links that I mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. I just wanted to remind you that this podcast has merch, and this podcast is also on Patreon, and there's some perks that come along with joining the Patreon. I will leave the links to both of those things in the show notes. I have a short episode for you today, but it is one that I really wanted to include in this season because I wanted to encompass as much of the LGBTQIA community that I could, and I do feel like I've done a really good job at that this season. And I've said this before, I never want to let the length of an episode stop me from doing an episode. Just because a story is short doesn't mean that it's not important. And the story that I have for you today is important. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 22nd episode of the 4th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. We are in season 4 of History Shelf, and it is titled They Are a Rainbow. This season of History Shelf, I will be covering each week a historical figure that was part of the LGBTQIA community. These were people that during their time they had to hide a part of their identity from the world. So while I fully believe that those who were out and proud in their lifetime, even if it had the potential to cost them everything, deserved to be praised and recognized, those are not the people that I will be covering this season. I am covering the ones that were made to love in the shadows, the ones that had to lie to most or all of the people around them. Now I know that sexual orientation and gender identity are complex, and some of the terms that I will use to describe these subjects were not around in some of their lifetimes. So some of these subjects obviously would not have used the same words to describe themselves as I will be using. But I don't want to get too hung up on my wording. I just want to celebrate a part of these individuals that in their time there was pressure all around them to feel shame about. I want to focus on that love and gender are not black and white. They are a rainbow. And for this week, I am talking about Lucy Hicks Anderson. Lucy was born Tobias Lawson in 1886 in Waddy, Kentucky, United States. Lucy was a transgender woman. Tobias was Lucy's dead name. So for this episode, I'm going to call Lucy Lucy, and I will be using the pronouns she and her. Lucy's mother was Nancy Lawson, and her father was William Lawson. Both Nancy and William were former slaves. From a very early age, Lucy said she was a girl. She wanted to be treated like a girl, and she wanted to dress like a girl. She wore dresses to school, and she wanted to go by the name Lucy. So, because Lucy was doing all of that, when Lucy was 9 years old, her mother took her to a doctor. The doctor took a look at Lucy and told Nancy that she should raise Lucy as a girl. So that is what Nancy did. And Lucy lived the rest of her life as a woman. This is the part of Lucy's story that really stuck out to me. I love that a doctor in the 19th century told a mother that she should raise her child as the gender that they identified as. And then the mother agreed. I wish we knew the doctor's name because he was ahead of his time. Lucy dropped out of school at the age of 15. She then became a housekeeper. She changed her name to Lucy, then she moved from Kentucky to Pecos, Texas when she was 20 years old. There in Texas, Lucy cleaned hotel rooms. She then moved to Silver City, New Mexico in 1920. In New Mexico, she met a man there named Clarence Hicks. Lucy and Clarence got married. They moved to Oxnard, California. She continued to work as a housekeeper. Lucy was also a very skilled chef and baker. She actually won baking contests. In 1926, her custard pie won first place. Lucy saved up money so she could buy an old boarding house property. But Lucy wasn't interested in owning a boarding house. Lucy turned that boarding house into a brothel. This was during Prohibition, and she also sold illegal liquor at the brothel house. Lucy was well known in her community. She became a socialite and hostess. She made connections and she used her connections to avoid jail. She was arrested one time for selling illegal liquor at her brothel, but one of her connections was Charles Donbon. He was the town's leading banker. Charles bailed Lucy out of jail because he had a huge dinner party coming up, and he said that the dinner party would have collapsed if Lucy were in jail. Lucy would also host her own parties. They occasionally would even make it into the local newspaper Oxnard Press Courier, like an August 3rd, 1927 entry that highlighted her party at the Oxnard Community Center that brought together 65 people from throughout Ventura and Los Angeles counties. Newspapers back in the day used to run stories like this. They would say, so-and-so had a party, or so-and-so went to visit their sister for a week in the next town over. Social media has been around longer than you think. It just wasn't on a computer or phone screen. It first started in our newspapers. Lucy would also host events for men going to war and their families. Local press reported that Lucy bought an estimated $50,000 in war bonds during World War II. Lucy was a thin woman that was 6 foot tall, and she liked to wear lavish dresses. This is what a Time magazine article said about her fashion. Quote, she wore bright, low-cut silk dresses from which her flat-like collarbones protruded, and she affected picture hats and high-heeled shoes. Her wigs were her pride. She had a long, black, wavy one, a short, straight bobbed, and for special occasions, a shoulder-length bob in red. End quote. Lucy hid the fact that she was a transgender woman from society. Of course, back then, even if she would have been open about it, she would not have used the term transgender because that was not a term that was around yet. The status that Lucy was able to achieve in an upper white society as a black woman was unheard of for this time. Lucy was also very charitable. She donated to the Red Cross and to the Boy Scouts. She would jokingly tell recipients, quote, just don't ask where the money came from, end quote. The time Lucy got arrested for alcohol was not the only time that Lucy had a run-in with the law. Lucy accused Ventura County Sheriff's deputies of misconduct. She said that they tried to force her and another person to confess to crimes that they did not commit. She told the Oxnard Press Courier that deputies tried to make them confess to paying off the chief of police in order to continue living in Oxnard. Witnesses said that the deputies treated them like dogs. They swore and cussed at them and savagely grilled them. Lucy and Clarence divorced in 1929. We don't know why. Lucy stayed single for a while, but then in 1944, Lucy married a man named Reuben Anderson. Reuben was a soldier. In 1945, there was an outbreak of a venereal disease that hit local Navy service members in Oxnard. A sailor claimed that he got the venereal disease from a brothel. Local brothels were investigated, including Lucy's. All of the women working at the brothel were forced to undergo medical examinations, including Lucy. Lucy tried to get out of the examination. She told them that she did not provide services to her patrons, but there was nothing that she could say or do that could get her out of the medical examination. Examiners found out that Lucy had been biologically assigned male at birth. Because that Lucy was married to a man, Ventura County District Attorney charged Lucy with perjury for signing a marriage application with another man. The DA said that Lucy lied about her sex and impersonated a woman. This news quickly spread beyond Ventura County. Time magazine wrote an article about it on November 5th, 1945. Because this was the 1940s, so of course most people were going to be assholes about this, some Time subscribers nominated Lucy for Time's Man of the Year as a way of criticizing her transgender identity. Lucy made a plea for her case during her trial. She told the jury, quote, "I defy any doctor in the world to prove that I am not a woman. I have lived, dressed, acted just what I am, a woman. It's only petty maliciousness that is trying to cause me heartache and harm. If they would devote the same amount of energy to local problems that are hurting the community, it would be much better. I have lived a good life, a Christian life. I have lived a good citizen for many years in this town, and I am going to die a good citizen." End quote. The jury found her guilty. The judge sentenced Lucy to 10 years of probation. As a condition of Lucy's release, she was forced to wear masculine clothing. This took place long before it was legal for two men to marry in the United States. Lucy had been receiving the financial allotments wives of soldiers got under the GI Bill. Because of that, the government charged her and Reuben with fraud. They also initially charged her with failing to register for the draft. Lucy proved that she was too old to register, but she was unable to beat the fraud charges. Both Lucy and Reuben were found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Lucy and Reuben were sent to separate prisons, but they were both sent to a men's prison. In prison, Lucy was forced to wear men's clothing. After they were released from prison, Lucy and Reuben went back to Oxnard to return to the life that they had had before the whole world knew about Lucy's secret. But they couldn't return to their former life. Oxnard banned them from the town. The community that had once took Lucy in with open arms had now turned their back on her. The police chief told her to leave town or risk prosecution. The couple then moved to Los Angeles, California. Lucy and Reuben lived together in Los Angeles until Lucy died in 1954. He was 68 years old. The Handbook of LGBT Elders calls Lucy one of the earliest documented cases of an African American transgender person. 15 years after Lucy died, the term transgender entered into the public vernacular. Today, Lucy is seen as a pioneer in bringing visibility and awareness to the transgender experience. She is widely believed to be the first person to advocate for their gender identity and defend the right to marry in a U.S. court. There hasn't been a lot of media representation of Lucy. Hopefully that changes, because I think her story is an important story to tell. But there is a chapter in C. Riley Snorton's book, Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity, on Lucy. There is also one episode of the HBO TV series Equal about Lucy's life. Equal is a documentary TV series that chronicles landmark events and leaders in LGBTQ history. Her story is told in episode 2 of the 4-part series. And that was the life of Lucy Hicks Anderson. Thank you so much for listening to the 22nd episode of the 4th season of History Shelf. I am going to be covering 15 people this season. Next week's episode is going to be about Sigrid Sassoon. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Instagram is at history_shelf_pod. The Twitter/X is at History Shelf Pod. And the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will give you a shout out on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of that episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. And with that, you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers, plus you will get a handwritten note of things mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want except for the Zippa Putty. You can also take out ad space on this podcast. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. Also, if you click on one of the affiliated links, there's one for Riverside, one for Amazon, and there's one for Bookshop. If you click on one of those links and you buy something, that helps support the podcast. But if you don't want any of the merch and you don't want any of the perks, and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support the podcast, I have turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is to just continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. Alright, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back